get new knowledge as well. And I also see a fellow Belgian face, so I know for a fact that it's afternoon for someone. My name is Benni De Jagere. Benni De Jagere, I currently work as an enterprise data architect for a company called Init and Real Dolmen here in Belgium, which means that I do lots of Teams meetings, I write lots of documents, and I drink way too much amounts of coffee. The thing is that all the reasons why I do that is to help my customers get value out of data. And lately it's been a heavy focus on Power BI, but I've also been spanning the Microsoft Data Platform and the Azure Data Platform as well before. A little bit more about me is I'm also engaged in a user group out in Belgium called dataminds.be. And we do similar things like the people here at Future Data Driven do as well. So it means that we put on fun community events, we help people engage with each other, network with each other, and learn new things. If you want to reach out to me on any of the social channels, they are linked here as well. Feel free to send me a question afterwards or something you want to discuss, and I'll try to do my very best to get back to you as well. Okay, let's get started. So what is this thing called data flows or Power BI data flows? The thing is that I've been around for a few years and I've heard the term data flows being used for way too many different things. So different products, different technology stacks, different scenarios, and I hear data flows coming back to me as well. And then when people ask me, hey, I'm trying to do this with data flows, all the cogs in my head, they start turning because I'm literally confused about what they're talking about. So a few of the options that pop into my head when people say I'm using data flows are, for instance, Google Cloud data flow or TensorFlow data flow or SSIS data flows, integration services, or Microsoft Flow, which turned into Power Automate. Azure Data Factory version 2, which had mapping data flows and wrangling data flows, but wrangling data flows is now called Power Query Online there. Power Apps data flows, which turns into Power Platform data flows. So there's lots of different things that use the exact same term data flow. So to make sure that everyone understands properly what I'm trying to discuss here as well today is Power BI data flows. So Power BI data flows is a concept that was introduced not so very long ago to Power BI as well. And to get you a better idea of what's happening, I want to give you an answer to a few basic questions. The first one is who? Who do I think should be using Power BI data flows? Who do I think is a proper fit for using this specific component of Power BI as well? And the answer mostly is that we're looking at these power users, those financial power users, those Excel savvy people, those people that have been used to doing their own data mashing, data wrangling, people that are able to get two Excel sheets to paste them together, do some dark magic with VLOOKUPs and XLOOKUPs, etc. So people that have that basic understanding of what to do, they will be able to excel with Power BI data flows because of the fact that it is aimed at that self-service, at that business user persona. Does that mean that a data consultant or a BI developer cannot use Power BI data flows? No, they can actually use this as well for very specific scenarios. The thing is, and I'll get back to that a few times as well, is if they are tasked with creating a specific solution, then you'll typically see those BI professionals, those technical people, grab towards the tools that they are used to working with, meaning Data Factory or Azure Synapse or Databricks or SSIS. You'll see them typically leaning towards those tools, but they can most definitely work with Power BI data flows as well. So what is this thing called Power BI data flows? But to answer that question, there is one thing that I want you to understand as well, and it's the problem, or it's the scenario where we have a single entity and many different data sets. So a dimension that exists in many different data sets. Date, person, product, department. So dimensions that are typically heavily used in many different places within your reporting solution. And one of the main issues that you're going to have is that if you do not have some form of semantic model, you'll likely end up creating lots of different versions. And then when you have those different versions, that probably means that if a change is introduced, you'll have to go make that change in all the different versions that exist, and you might end up forgetting one or make a fault in when configuring one or when changing one. And it's more error prone that you have. So that semantic model, whether it be an analysis services tabular model, an all-up cube, a multidimensional cube, or if it's a data warehouse, or if it's a data lake, whatever, if it's a store, if it's a centralized store that you have to create that unified version of the truth, then that will help you get going as well. The thing is as well is that right now within Power BI, well, before within Power BI, you had a data set and then that was it. Either you worked with the entire data set or you didn't work with the entire data set at all, or you had to end up creating your own new data set as well. So with the introduction of shared datasets, that was already a big step forward, because before it was literally, this is the data set and you have to build all your reports within this single data set. But now you can actually relate to that data set as well. But then one of the new features that still trips up many people to try to explain this and try to pronounce this in one single go, called direct query over Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services. That has the potential to actually go ahead and change the way we work within Power BI, because this will allow us to start mixing and matching from different data sets. The thing is, it is currently still in preview. And once you try to go with some more complex scenarios, there are odds that you'll run into some of the limitations that currently still exist. Is there potential? Yes, there is definitely potential. But for the scenario that you have right now, let's say that you have a data set and you need to get one single dimension or one single table from another data set, then that scenario is a bit tricky to solve using just data sets as well. So for instance, if we look at two different data sets that we have right now, and one of the things that we're using in there is a date dimension, which is something that every single Power BI file uses. Let's say 99% of the Power BI files, we always see a date dimension or a date table in there. But if we have two date tables, if we have two data sets, that means that that date table is probably created in both of those files. And let's say that we have right now, we have our date that has the calendar information, and our fiscal year starts on April 1st. And then the company is acquired, or the company is changing systems, whatever, the headquarters is moving, and the fiscal year is being changed to July 1st, which is, it can happen. Or we decide to use a new system of 13 periods in a year of 28 days. Who knows, instead of months. That means potentially that we have to go change all those single date tables because they are scattered all around the different data sets that we have, if we do not have some form of semantic model in front of that. And that's where Power BI Dataflows can actually start playing a role, because we're abstracting that level, because we're making sure that that logic is being executed in a layer before our Power BI datasets, before those datasets, making sure that any logic that we have is in a more centralized place, and the manageability goes down because it's all in one place. We only have to load that data once. We only have to make those alterations once. That's the entire purpose of making sure why we're using these data flows, for reusability and for reducing complexity. That's the thing. Oh, okay, good. We've got the who, we've got the what. But then how does this thing actually work? And that is the lengthiest question of all, because that is where the real explanations have to come up. So Power BI Dataflows was introduced in late 2018, and it only went into general availability in April 2019, which means that it is actually only 2.5 years old, meaning it's not that old of a product. It is still fairly new. To summarize what Power BI Dataflows is, you can best summarize this as a cloud-based Power Query experience, or Power Query Online. Let's call it that one as well. It means that the Power Query experience you've been seeing inside of Excel or inside of Power BI Desktop will now reside in your browser, meaning you can use it from anywhere that you're working with. If you have a browser, you can use Power Query as well. And the entire purpose of Power Query, in whatever shape or format you're using it, is aimed at that self-service data preparation, enabling business users to do their own data transformation types. And mostly the target audience is those non-technical or those business user personas. So those business people that have that understanding, that have that tech savviness of working with data and doing complex, well, doing the basic scenarios as well. So Power BI Dataflows is all about reusability, creating reusable data entities. So making sure that you only have to do the logic once and then reuse it across the board. That's the entire goal of what we're trying to achieve here. I do want to stress, because this is one of the questions that I get all the time, does this replace a data warehouse or a data lake or a delta lake or a data lakehouse or whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to use? And it does not replace this at all. Let me explain you why. This is aimed at self-service business users. So it is also going to abstract a level of complexity to not overly confuse them. So for instance, if I would have to go and implement type 2 slowly changing dimensions, I honestly wouldn't know how to get started with this on Dataflow, because I'd have to figure it out. But do we expect Joe from accounting to do type 2 slowly dimensions in Excel? Most of the time not. That's probably things that we're going to try and figure out in a data warehouse or in a delta lake, data lakehouse, whatever we want to call it. That's typically something that we let the BI developers, the BI professionals do. It is aimed, in my opinion, at doing those simple star schemas to get those things together. So to make sure that business users can do their data preparation, can do their data modeling themselves without being blocked by IT involvement. And it is, like any other Power BI artifact, it is to be managed and to be secured in the exact same way. It resides in a workspace, which means that determines who can access it and who can do something with it. But the most important thing is that under the covers, it is something called a Managed CDM folder. A Managed Common Data Model folder. The managed part indicates that Power BI takes care of everything for us. It abstracts the entire layer of authenticating towards the underlying storage, making sure that the data is stored somewhere, that it is partitioned, that it is archived. That's all things Power BI managed for us. And then the CDM part, the common data model part, is something that I will get back to in the next step as well. But first, I quickly want to show you a basic thing, like what is this Power BI Dataflows, so that you have that understanding as well. To give you a blunt idea, to give you a vague idea, every demo that I've been doing for the past 2 years have all been based on this use case, on this public data set. For the city of New York, they have open data for all their city bikes, meaning that if someone picks up a bike from a station, they drive around with it, they put it back somewhere else, that is logged as a transaction. And this data set currently has in total, I think, 115 million transactions starting from June 2013, which means that it's a good data set for me to try out some things, to make sure that I can do some performance tuning or see how well something handles with more data, etc. If you're interested, the link that is in the slide can be used to get that data as well. And this is the data set that I use for all my public sessions, as I mentioned, for the last 2 years. So, Dataflows, what is this thing? So I am currently within a workspace. It is a V2 or a new workspace experience. And one thing that I am going to show you up front is that this is running in a Power BI Premium per user mode, meaning that I will be able to use premium features. That doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to use them right now, but that I am able to do this. And the entire pro versus premium thing, I will definitely get back to this as well. So to get started, let's go to new and start creating a data flow. Start creating a data flow and build something. So, okay, then I say, yes, okay, let's get started with building out a new table and say that I want to build a data flow on top of a Azure SQL database. There we go. Basic authentication, maybe not production proof for your enterprise, to be discussed with your cybersecurity department. But this is this is an Azure SQL database, which means that I do not have to authenticate towards any form of gateway, etc., and that I can just get started with this. Okay, so I go with next, and then this is the experience where it all seems very, very familiar with what we've been using inside of Power BI Desktop or Excel or Power Platform data flows or wrangling data flows, because that Power Query experience is feeling really, really familiar for everyone that's ever worked with it. So let's say that I want to select two small tables because I don't want to spend waiting time here on data loading in there. And it brings me to the Power Query screen, which means that it is exactly what we've been used to, because we have our query settings, we have our steps that have been applied, we have, let me make sure that I indicate what I'm looking at, and we have our queries that are also being displayed as well. So this is a very similar experience to Power BI Desktop. So the thing is, why should I be using this and why shouldn't I be using Power Query Online? The thing is that, for my personal opinion, there are some pretty cool features here that do not yet exist inside of the desktop. So the first one that I want to highlight is this, and it's not super obvious unless you know it, but this is something called a query folding indicator. And the entire topic of query folding is something that I can easily discuss with you for 2 hours or more, but it is the process where we're trying to send back all the steps and all the transformations that we're doing here inside of Power Query, and we're trying to push that back towards, in this case, the SQL Server. So not every transformation that we do in Power Query is supported and then it will break, etc. But before, within Power BI Desktop, the on-premises version, it was really hard to know what is actually happening, because you had to right-click on this and then go to View Native Query, and then you could only see whether the folding was still happening or not. But this actually allows it to see with a visual indicator if it is folding or not, which, if you have to start troubleshooting, saves you some time and not having to go look at all the different steps, not having to go look at all the different steps that you're looking at. So for me, that's a really useful one as well. The other one is there is something called a diagram view, which is also coming. I have to click the button here below, which is also coming to Power BI Desktop, but I'm honestly not completely sure when it's arriving, because I still need to read up on a few blog posts, etc. But it is a more graphical interface of where your data is coming from and which steps I'm trying to execute. So these are two really basic steps that I've done right now. But if you go into a more complex, where you're merging data into one single query, where you're deleting some rows, where you're duplicating stuff, this becomes really useful as well, because it helps you keep that overview of what you're actually trying to do. So for the general part, this is Power Query as you've all seen it before and as you've all used it before. And I'm seeing questions now that, can you build a data flow off a series of Excel sheets? Yes, you definitely can. The basic thing is that you either go load in every single Excel sheet as one, or you write off a function which is going to loop over a folder that you have and dynamically pick up all the Excel sheets that you have in there. So it is definitely possible as well to build that off your Excel sheets as well. I can try stop the sharing and reshare again if more people are having issues with the screen sharing. Let me just try that. The thing is that I've witnessed this before with other Teams calls, and it's usually something to do with the end user on that part, meaning that you have to drop the call and get back in. That fixed it in the other occasions where I've seen that behavior before. But, okay. The thing is, as soon as I want to do this, okay, I can save this. I can say, let's go ahead and save and close this. You're going to validate what's happening. And then let's say I want to name this future data driven. Let's save it. Now the data is being loaded, and there is some magic happening under the covers, because under the covers, this data is now being loaded into an actual data lake, into an actual Power BI Dataflows Azure Data Lake storage underneath, which is pretty cool if you ask me. So I now have a new data flow. The thing is, what do I do with this now? Okay, so I have my data, what can I actually go do with this? So let's say that I want to open up a new Power BI Desktop file and start consuming this data as well, because it is all about how are you going to consume that data afterwards as well. Because let's say that you've got this entire thing built, what are you going to do with this once everything is passed? It is going to your get data experience and then say, okay, I want to get a Power BI data flow. And as I click on this, I just realized that I am not logged in with the correct user. So this is going to be fun. Okay. Better than I expected. I'm actually impressed. So this is where I'm going to be displayed all the workspaces that I have access to and the workspaces that have data flows in them. So I have effectively about 90 workspaces where I've been added in, and Teams pages and Teams channels and Office 365 pages, etc. But there are only 2 workspaces where data flows exist in. So it also makes that abstraction there of what is being used. And I'm now seeing these 2 tables that I have here as well. So what I do with this is I'm now running inside of import mode, which means that I'm going to import the data that was imported into the data lake. Can I do this with direct query as well? Yes, at a later phase, because it is not completely there yet. I think it's not inside of general availability yet. And it is also considered a premium feature. So let's say that I load in my data. This is all import mode, so it means that I can also go ahead and connect to those Excel files, go collect data from my SQL server, collect data from a web source, whatever I want to do it. So getting that single table out of the data flow that I actually want to be using, be it date table, be it my person table, my product table, making sure that I can get that reusable information out there as well. So let me quickly show you as well. There we go. One of the data flows where I've been doing a bit more in. It's still a demo version, so it's not an enterprise solution on this. But if you go and build out some more things, it actually allows you to see that, okay, right now I've got my table here called my system region and my station table, where my system region table is being merged into my station table. So it helps me to see what is actually being done. What's the basic form of lineage onto that data that I'm seeing? So to summarize, why do I personally think right now that Power Query Online is a better experience than Power BI Desktop? It's these 2 features, because they really help you grasp what is happening a bit better. Over time, they will also be added to Power BI Desktop, but this is the situation as is. Does this mean that it is a completely perfect solution? Okay, so Gina, what was the premium aspect of consuming data flows in Power BI Desktop? So the data that I imported into Power BI Desktop was import mode. The other aspect that I referred to was being able to consume your data flows, was to consume the data flows to work with direct query data. Meaning that you can go ahead and perform direct query scenarios on the data that is located inside of data flows as well. And that feature right now is premium only, because the technical part, it is simulating a SQL endpoint on top of data lake storage. And because of some technical reasons and pricing reasons, that is considered a premium feature. Okay, but let's get back to some slideware. The thing is, I also want to make sure that you understand what is this thing called common data model underneath. And to give you the marketing fluff, it is a unified metadata layer for cloud apps and services. And it is all about the unified part for me and about the metadata part. That's what stands out the most. The thing is that it is considered to be a single version of how you can work with that data across different platforms and different toolings. And it is not Microsoft only. It is also something called the Open Data Initiative, where SAP and Adobe have also entered with Microsoft. So they did create this initiative. They did create the intent to start using this format to share data across these different platforms. In reality, is it completely there? No, there are still some kinks to be worked out, even within the complete Microsoft solution as well. The thing is that it is all about that metadata, because it means that what is happening is that the metadata of all those queries that I have is being stored somewhere. And the way that it's being stored, that metadata, is what makes it that unified form. And it means that we're talking about a shared set of how the data is structured, how the data is stored, what is being used to store that data, where it's being located as well. But the most beautiful part of this is that it also comes with a set of default entities, which also kind of betrays the origin of where this came from, or where this has come from. It means that originally they start talking about this common data model or common data service in the Dynamics 365 space. So those default entities, they are all Dynamics 365, either customer engagement, CRM, or finance and operation, AX oriented. Does that mean that you only have to stick with those? No, you can extend those entities for your own if you want to, or you can even create your new entities as well. The thing is, it has to just adhere to the format, to the manifest, to declare those entities as well. So to give you an idea of what are the different basic entities that you have there, the default entities, it's all about accounts, campaigns, contacts, about cases, about general ledger. So as I mentioned, the Dynamics 365 part, that is where it comes from. But the entire idea of this thing called common data model is to reuse this across different solutions, across different applications inside of the landscape. And what you're seeing with Dataverse is a really big step towards this, because Dataverse is being pointed as an underlying scenario for all these different things. The thing is, that's the BI developer, the BI professional in me. Would I load 150 million rows of records inside of Dataverse? Not at this point, because it's going to be not an optimal experience for performance. But are you talking about not that big data sets, not that large volumes, then yes, you can definitely do it. The only thing you have to take into account is make sure that the way the data is structured is usable across these different scenarios, across these different platforms as well. But what does this thing look like? What is this common data model? Well, you have to look at this as a collection of CSV files, period. It means that the data is being loaded into CSV files into a data lake. That's what it's all about. So what I've just done right now is I've created a data flow called future data driven. So that means that if I were to look at the real-time version of this, it would say future data driven. And then I have this model.json file. And the model.json file is going to show me which tables I have, which steps are being executed in Power Query, the metadata of the attributes, etc. So all these different things. So that's what it would show me as well. And I'll show you an example of that one later on as well. But then per table that I have, it's going to dump out all the data into CSV files. And this is also where you have a gotcha that you have to understand, is that you cannot influence how the data is partitioned inside of CSV files, because it is a managed service. It does that for you. You cannot interfere with this. Will you be able to do that in the future? Maybe. I cannot say with certainty. If we look at a more complex scenario, it would mean that you can combine that data into that single data lake storage for different applications, different workspaces, different entities, and all have those data together with you. So what does this actually look like? You can get this yourself, because for instance, the data flow that I've just created called future data driven, I can very easily export that model.json file. If I go ahead and click on the three dots to get up the settings panel, I can export this and start looking at that data. So let me open this file. Let's see if Visual Studio decides to work for me today. Actually, you're also a bit surprised why it didn't open Visual Studio Code, but such is life. And this is giving me a JSON folder. And it means that this JSON folder gives me a large collection of metadata. So it gives me a collection of metadata where I have, where I have my tables defined, and then a bunch of information on what is actually in there, a bunch of information on the queries. And if I go further, if I keep scrolling, it's going to give me the Power Query that's being used as well. And if I keep scrolling a bit further, it's going to give me even a lot more further apparently. It's going to give me the type that it is, if it's a text data type, if it's an integer data type as well. The cool thing of this is, okay, let's say that I have my model.json file. I can actually go ahead and also say, okay, I want to get started with the data flow. For instance, I don't want it to be in this workspace. I want it to be somewhere else. So I could go ahead and just say, okay, get me that data flow. Get me that data flow and say import model. Import that model and then go look at that JSON file. Import that JSON file, and now that JSON file is being imported, and it's just going to make a full copy of that model structure that I had as well. And that's going to give me, the exact same experience. So it is actually quite easy to get that data going somewhere as well. Somewhere else if we needed to. We needed to move this from a workspace, etc. But there we go. There are a few other things that I want to cover with you as well. So how are we going to do this the data refresh, for instance? Whoops. So the data refresh works the same way as I mentioned with other Power BI artifacts that I've mentioned before. It means that the manual refresh can be triggered the same way. You can select this in the UI. You can set up scheduled refreshes as well to make sure that your data is being refreshed on the top of the timestamp that you want to have. The thing is that typically you're going to load your data flow and then potentially load data sets that are dependent on that first data flow. So there is also a Power Automate action which allows you to check if a data flow is being executed, if it's done, and if that's done, then you can trigger actions to start executing those data sets as well, so that you have a fully automatic way of processing every dependent object on that data flow as well. The thing is, and this I have to be very honest about, is that the troubleshooting experience within Power Query Online is a bit troublesome. It's a bit bothersome. It is being improved upon. They're working on this, but it's not completely there yet on all the different scenarios that we have. Meaning, if you want to get the most detailed version that you can have, you need to go to the refresh history screen. Or if you're running with a gateway on premises, you need to go look at the gateway logs. It is not always super easy to get the exact error message out, and that is troublesome. As well as if you're trying to link several data flows together, because you can also get data from another data flow, it's automatically going to refresh the lineage chain for you so that the data is refreshed when you actually need it. And then a bigger drawback for me personally is right now, when you load a data flow, it means that you're loading the entire thing. So incremental refresh only exists for premium capacity or premium per user subscriptions. Is it for now? Is it going to come? I honestly don't know, but it is something to keep in mind if you are not running with premium per user or premium capacity. Definitely an important thing to keep in mind. The thing is, I also mentioned that the entire point of using this is about reusability. So how do I go about and start reusing queries across different data flows as well to make it a bit more interesting? How do I actually go about, okay, I have my Power BI desktop file, my PBIX file, and how do I go about in converting that into a data flow? Well, there is no real migration experience. The migration experience you have at this point is selecting your queries in Power BI desktop, Control-C, making sure that they're on the clipboard, and then doing Control-V inside of the Power Query experience. And that gives you a copy-paste experience for those queries. There are also a few community tools out there that allow you to do some PowerShell, execute that PowerShell, and they automatically upload those things for you as well. So it is not a completely managed solution that say, I want to migrate this to data flows. It is still a manual labor that you have to do. But then as soon as you are in your data flow, that's where we're starting to make the exception. That's where we're starting to make the difference in between, are you a pro user or are you a premium based user? Because for the pro users, the only way that you can reuse a different query, that you can reuse something, is by doing it the way that you were doing it before inside of the query. Means that you have to either reference the query, duplicate the query, append another query, merge with a query, and then start using this. The thing is, it is also only going to work if you mark that query disabled for load, so that you can actually make sure that the logic is there, but that the data is only being used afterwards. And then, does this mean that your data is going to be duplicated? Yes. If you're referencing, that means that the data is going to be duplicated every single time you reference this. If you're duplicating, it's going to duplicate everything again as well. It means that the logic that you're using is also being duplicated. But then, for the lucky ducks among us, who are running Power BI Premium or Premium per user, there is this feature called linked or computed entities. And they leverage this thing called in-lake compute, which means that the transformations are being done inside of the data lake. Because right now, if you're using Power BI Pro and you're making alterations, it means that the data is taken out of the data lake, transformations are being done, and it's being dumped back in again, which is also one of the reasons why incremental refresh is not working for Pro, because it needs to take out all the data and then reload the data again. So in-lake compute, or the fancy feature name called Enhanced Compute Engine, allows this to do those transformations with the data residing in your data lake. And that currently requires premium capacity to back this up. If you have this, it means that you can reference any entity in any other workspace. The data will only be stored inside of the original entity. So that means that you're no longer duplicating the data all over the place, which is potentially a lot more interesting if you're working with bigger data sets, if you're working with bigger volumes, etc. Okay. Let me go. Okay. So how do we actually work with gateways and security? How does that actually work as well? Well, it works the exact same way, meaning that if you have those on-premises data sources, your SQL servers, your on-premises SAP systems, whatever, then you are going to use the exact same gateway as you had on-premises. But that is something that is important to keep in mind as well, because it also means that if you are working with that data, if you want to be publishing your data flows on top of this, you have to make sure that you are also added as a person that can publish data towards that data source, publish data sets and data flows on that data source. So you need to be added there as well. And then how do you go and secure your data flows? And that is something to keep in mind as well. So a data flow resides in a workspace. So if you are a viewer, that means that you are not able to do anything with that data flow in there. If you're an admin, a member, or a contributor, that means that you can actually start interfacing with that object as well. Does that mean that you have all the permissions to do? No, because a data flow currently still has this aspect called an owner. And the owner is the person that created it or has the ownership on the data flow itself. And they have all the permissions to do something. Right now, it means that only the owner can make modifications in the queries that exist in the data flow. Meaning, if you are working in a multiple person team working on the same data flow, you have to take good care of who is owner and who can make those alterations. So the changes are coming that you should be able to do this with multiple people inside of the same team, but I have not seen them go live yet. So yeah, I'm eagerly awaiting from this one as well. But it also means that if you are consuming data coming from a data flow, that data will most likely, in most cases that I've seen so far, will always be import mode. And if we're using import mode, that means that the security, the data security, is the responsibility of the person designing the data set. So there is no such thing right now as row-level security for a data flow or object-level security for a data flow. It has to be implemented again inside of the data set. Meaning, if you are looking at potentially a bit more sensitive data in your data flow, then it might not be the best scenario for you at this specific point in time. Then, I've covered the how, hopefully. Why should we actually go start using this? Why is this thing something that we want to be using? Well, What I mentioned before as well is that it's aimed at those business users, those self-service users. And one of the scenarios that I've seen at many of my customers in my own organization as well is that the IT departments, the BI people, the data engineers, they're all swamped. They're drowning in work and they don't have time to handle every one of the aspects, every one of the requests that are coming in. Meaning that they start looking for ways around it. They start looking for backdoors. They start looking for loopholes. And I come from Belgium, and Klaas can confirm this. We are the world champions of finding loopholes, period. There is no one better at finding loopholes than Belgians. And I see this a lot inside of Belgian organizations. They just start building their own things. They'll go to Excel files. They'll go to Access files. They start building their own things. By giving them a tool that will more easily allow them to be incorporated into something bigger later on, it helps them move forward. It helps them get the insights of the data that they actually need. And if we don't give them something like a Power BI Dataflows or an Excel or a Power BI Desktop, that's when they go looking on their own. And then they'll come up with all sorts of exotic solutions, or they're introducing a new tool. Maybe Alteryx is coming in, and that's when exotic situations starts to arise. So these data flows, they are for those business users that have that tech savviness, that aren't afraid of looking at the Power Query window, that see 3 steps and think, okay, this is good, this is happening. It's aimed for them to build those reusable entities, to make sure that that data is located somewhere where it only has to be changed once and then can be reused across these different data sets. It makes it for them also as well, if they're using multiple queries, if they're using multiple data flows, it makes it a bit more easy for them to compose and orchestrate these things. Or look at more complex scenarios where there's multiple data flows trying to do the logic for them that is needed. And it is aimed at self-service. That is it. It is self-service, period. So what I've all told up until now is basic vanilla flavored Power BI Dataflows. But you can actually take this a step forward, because I mentioned that it's a managed CDM folder. And the managed part is something that we can go around as well, because it means that we can also introduce our own storage account, or bring your own storage account. And it means that we can introduce a storage account, an Azure Data Lake storage account that we manage, that we control, and link that towards Power BI as well. So the data is going to be stored inside of that data lake storage account, meaning that at that specific point in time, we can start accessing that data and start using it somewhere else. Because I did forget to mention this, and that's my bad, is on the managed part, it is located in the data lake, which we cannot access. It is completely off limits. The only thing that can access it is Power BI itself and Power BI Dataflows. That's it. So if you want to have that data reusable across the board with Data Factory or Excel on premises, no, Excel can consume data flows as well now, with Tableau, for instance, or something, then we want to be using our external storage as well, because that is where we have the complete control over this. It is doable within a few simple steps these days, where you can do it as a workspace admin and say, connect to Azure, say which specific subscription you want to use, the storage account, etc., and then you're good to go. And that means that those CSV files, those single CSV files that you saw in the screenshots, are completely there for you to use. And that's where the cool scenarios start popping into my head. Because what I've done with a customer, for instance, is built some sort of a master data services or an MDS online version, where I put them in charge of Excel files that are used as mapping tables. And I say, okay, business, you're responsible for those tables. You load them in with data flows there. They do not know that the storage is external, but then I pick them up and start using that data inside of Data Factory or Databricks. Start incorporating that into my bigger enterprise data solutions. But they are the ones responsible for those mapping tables. Meaning that it is a format that we've agreed on, but they have that control, they have that level of granularity, and it also allows them that if that data should change, it also allows them to do it themselves, because they can change that data in there and reload the data somewhere else. But that's just one of the solutions. That's just one of the scenarios. There are multiple things that you can also look at this. The thing is, that is going for output scenarios, but it also works the other way around. I can also create external tools, use external toolings to input that data into a CDM folder. This is called something called external CDM folders, where I actually load that data into the format that it's expecting, and then I can pick that up with Power BI itself as well. And it is any tool that uses that standard, that knows how to create that manifest file, will be able to do that. And that's what makes it really cool as well, because you can get data in and you can get data out. So the thing is as well is you have to create your own storage account, make sure that you have the permissions, etc. set up, and then go for attaching a common data model folder. And in a second you've got this attached, you link to it, it's also usable there as well. And it is the exact same thing that you had with your Power BI Dataflows. Okay, so I've told a lot of things, but I also want you to know that there are a few caveats. There are a few things right now which makes it not completely an ideal solution for those larger things that you may be looking at. A lot of the things that I'm mentioning are being actively worked on. It is Power BI Dataflows, as I mentioned, is still a fairly new product, a fairly young product, and they're investing heavily into this. The thing is as well, is something that I should have mentioned before, is that the direction that I've been seeing lately from Microsoft over the past year and a half is that the Power Query Online experience that we are seeing across those many different toolings, they're actually converging into one as well. So they're aiming in the future at a more unified experience across those different toolings. Because right now, if you're looking at Power Query Online inside of Power Platform Dataflows or inside of Power BI Dataflows, there are some differences in there as well. And they are working hard to get those out of the way. Is a few things that you have to keep in mind. So in my opinion, if you want to go look at building out these larger data sets, it means that you will have to rely on the features called incremental refresh and linked entities, etc. So that means that if you want to do those more cool or complex things, you're probably bound to premium or premium per user. Can you do it in Pro? Yes, you can, but it will probably take you a bit longer to do this. And because of the fact that this is there as well, it will mean that if you're starting to make these modifications, it will probably take you a bit longer as well. So one of the things that currently still exists inside of Power BI Dataflows is that when you're making a larger query inside of the browser and you're clicking save or continue, it can take a fairly long time to validate that query. So something called background validation should arrive very soon. That allows us to save and then just move on and do something else while the background is finishing off the validation of this. But that means that if you have a fairly lengthy query right now or a large number of queries, you probably have to let that browser window stay open for a few minutes or more. The thing as well is, what I've highlighted now is that if you've got your data flow and you're making a change in there, that will drop all the data that you have. It will drop the schema, recreate the schema, and then go again and load everything in there. The same thing with premium, with those incremental refresh. It means if you modify something, all the data needs to be reloaded. Meaning you have to take very good care on what you're putting in there and how sensitive to change this also is. Because if it is 100 millions of data that exists in a schema and the schema is prone to changes, then that might not be the best scenario for you. At this point in time, it also means that a data flow is only usable, only modifiable, only able to be modified by the owner itself. So by the person that has clicked it, that the owner writes to their personal account or shared account. Annoying if you're working in a multi-person team. It is going to be fixed soon. So it is something that we're really looking forward to seeing arrive as well. When you're working with a gateway data source, it becomes a bit tricky when you're using multiple credentials, especially if you're using Active Directory-based credentials. It can become a really tricky scenario. It's something that you need to keep in mind as well if you're doing this, for instance. If you have an SAP system that has data and you need to connect with that service account, and you have a SQL system you need to connect with that service account, it can become troublesome. So you may need to split it up into different data flows and then converge that data into one new data flow as well. So it does take you, if you go to those more complex scenarios, it does take you some time to start thinking about these things. Yep, thank you, Tracy. 10 more minutes. Yep, thank you. If you're looking at a CI/CD experience, so a continuous integration, continuous deployment, the story isn't completely smooth. I'm not 100% sure, I should check this, if data flows are being supported into Power BI deployment pipelines. I'm not sure, and I should actually check this. But if you're doing it with the external things, with Azure DevOps or Jenkins, whatever you're using, it actually means that you're going to drop and recreate a new data flow, which also means that the underlying ID will change, and that can potentially introduce you to some other different scenarios where you're working with this. And if you're importing it, it will not always fix existing references to linked entities. So again, if you're working with a more complex scenario or a more complex setup, you may need to look at a few things as well to make sure that it is still working 100% correctly. And then to close off, there we go, to close off, one slide that Matthew Roach, a Power BI CAT member, with a very fond preference for swords and pointy objects, he's a big supporter of Power BI Dataflows as well. And Matthew summarizes the entire thing of data flows into one single slide. And for me, it summarizes pretty good what it's all about, because it means that everything that I've been highlighting comes back here as well. It means that it's in that self-service data preparation, familiar Power Query experience, on the Azure Data Lake storage, and utilizing the CDM folder. So it's all those same things that I've been using as well. And it's all being shown again into one single summary slide as well. The thing is, I mainly want to focus on the not side, because that also gives me an answer to some of the common questions that I've been hearing a lot as well. And people ask me, should I use data flows or should I use data sets? The thing is, they are a different thing, meaning that if you have a data flow, you will still need to create a data set to be used as your model, because the data set is what creates your data model for Power BI to be used. That's what creates the underlying Azure analysis, the underlying analysis services instance. So the data flow is a semantic layer that transports your data into CSV files. So it's not something that you're typically going to be working on with your end users. So if you're using data flows, you still need to use the data sets. In my personal opinion, data flows are also not a solution, or also not a replacement for a complete data warehouse solution. You can do cool things with data flows, but as I mentioned, if I have to go implement type 2 slowly changing dimensions, I probably will not do this with Power BI Dataflows, because I'm quite fond of my sanity. It also means that if you have people using Data Factory or integration services or Databricks or whatever, those people that are used to working with this, they'll probably stick there as well, in the corner in their comfort zone of things that they actually know. And that's because of the technical persons, the technical people that I've worked with in the past, they feel that it is a bit too limited for them. But on the other hand, that's really where it shines as well for those Excel, like for those business users. If they're not seeing 27,000 buttons, they have no idea what is in there, or if they don't know where the context menus are, etc. So it makes it easier for them to get started. Does it mean, again, that those data engineers cannot use this? They can, but for their more heavy lifting scenarios, they'll likely go to the tools that they're using. You can use Power BI Dataflows in a pro-only scenario. It means that you can use this. The thing is, you just have to take into account what you're doing, where you're getting data, how you're loading that data, and how you're referencing it. but you can use it with a complete pro solution. And again, if you're not talking about millions and millions of rows of data, you shouldn't worry about this too much. It is actually going to help you move forward as well. Okay, so to get to the end of the session, there are a few things that I want to stress again, that I want to reiterate again, that I think are the most important things to take away with you. For Power BI Dataflows, why you should implement this is for those business-driven initiatives. It is for those business people that have a need for data. They want to get insights from their data. This allows them to get started themselves and build it out and go for that reusable scenario later on. Because we all know Excel is a good tool, but if it's an Excel file that only lives on the laptop of Joe from accounting, and Joe from accounting is going for a holiday break for 4 weeks, then we may have an issue. So it also needs to be somewhere that we can incorporate it and start interfering with this ourselves if something needs to be changed or if data needs to be loaded again. If you're working in a scenario where you have a data warehouse, data lake house, whatever buzzword you try to prefer these days, it helps you to fill existing gaps. It helps you to make a quick prototype. It helps you to test something out and see if it's valuable, and then start building on that later on as well. The thing is, and that's something that I've not seen nearly enough at my customers, is that if you have something that works, if it is something really good, then that's the part where it should, in most cases, actually be taken into the responsibility of your center of excellence or your IT department or your business IT responsible, whatever, to make sure that it grows into a mature solution with a bit more constraints on versioning, how are we doing changes, how are we doing change management, those things. The thing is, as well, is personally, whenever I start with Dataflows, I just always put it to external storage, period, because it makes things easier at a later time, at a later point in time, if I actually need them. Because if you're doing the if you're doing the managed storage from Power BI and you want to switch later on, it means that you have to reload the entire data again. So drop the data on the managed side, reload the data on the bring your own data lake storage side. So it makes sense for me to actually just start doing that in the other side as well. So in April, which actually has been a long time ago as well, there have been lots of new updates announced, which are going to make the experience for Dataflows a lot more smooth as well. So that's what I mentioned with the future is promising. It also means the same thing for Dataflows. They are investing heavily in it, and we are looking forward to when these will actually start arriving. To close off, one thing that I am very fond of as well, and it is bordering on the aspect of self-service BI. So personally for me and for Nimrod Avissar as well, self-service BI is not about products, technologies, toolings, etc. You can use whatever tool you want to. The key of everything you're trying to do with self-service BI or with data analytics in general is about the people and the processes and the methodologies. It is about how these people work together, what works for them as an organization, and how they make sure that the right data shows up at the right person at the right time. If you're using Excel for this, if you're using Power BI, if you're using Tableau, doesn't really matter, but it's mostly about the organization, about the culture that you have in your organization and how you're actually leveraging this. That's just my personal opinion. In the slide deck, there are a bunch of resources that I typically refer to as well, which you can also get. I will post the link to my slide deck again, which just leads me to the fact that if you have some feedback on this session, please do deliver to the feedback. Please do deliver to the feedback mechanism. And that also means that I am done rambling on.